Privacy is a concept, a value, and a basic human right that is hugely important, but widely and increasingly contested. As we grow more inclined to share our personal information and data for the benefits of public safety, personal convenience, and connectivity, we need, now more than ever, to consider the urgent questions surrounding privacy. Carissa Véliz is a privacy expert, associate professor in philosophy at the Institute for Ethics in AI, and a fellow at the Hertford College at the University of Oxford. Her recent book, Privacy is Power, exposes how our privacy is eroded by big tech and governments, why that matters, and what we can do about it. Join her now as she engages with these questions and more.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. It's really good to be here. I don't know if the presentation worked because we were having some technical problems right before going live. So in case you have no idea who you're looking at, I'm an associate professor at the Institute for Ethics in AI at the University of Oxford. And I am the author of a book called Privacy is Power that got published last year and was selected by The Economist as one of the best books in 2020. It's really nice that we can have some kind of interaction. Unfortunately, I can't see you. Hopefully you can see me, but I can receive questions and comments. So feel free to write those in and I might address them at the end, but I actually can try to address them while I talk so that we can make this as interactive as possible. It's weird talking at a screen, as you might have experienced. So if you can let me know that you're out there and that you are, if you have any thoughts, I would be very, very grateful for that. So today I'll talk about the relationship between privacy and power and how we have sort of missed that by focusing too much on issues like whether our data gets sold or not, or things having to do with property, as opposed to thinking about data as a kind of power. And what I argue in this book is that really in the digital age, power is all about data, and whoever has the data will have the power. If we give too much powers to company, too much of our personal data to companies, it shouldn't surprise us later on when it turns out that they are writing the rules of the game and they are deciding whether we get a loan or not, whether we get a job or not, whether we have access to healthcare, all kinds of really important decisions that they shouldn't be making, maybe. If we give too much of our personal data to governments, we risk sliding into some form of authoritarianism. And for democracy to be strong, the bulk of the power needs to be in the hands of the citizenry. And in the digital age, that means that we have to have some sort of control over our personal data. Another idea that I want to convey is that it's a mistake to think about privacy as something individual. Of course, it's about personal data. Of course, it's about you, but it's also very much a collective issue. And it's a collective issue, at least in two ways. On the one hand, every time you expose yourself, you're exposing others as well. So for instance, when you expose details about your location, you expose details about your neighbors and your family and co-workers. When you expose details about your DNA, you're exposing your parents, your siblings, your children, and maybe even distant kin who might have very bad consequences from it. For instance, they might get deported. This has actually happened on the basis of a genetic test that suggests that they're not from the country that they are claiming they're from. Or they might get denied life insurance because it turns out that you have some kind of genes that are concerning. And these people didn't consent to your sharing that data. But your data contains data about other people. So that's the first way in which privacy is much more collective than we might think at a first glance. The second way is that we suffer the consequences of losses of privacy together. In this sense, it's very much similar to ecological damages. So even if you're super good at recycling and you do everything right, if nobody else does anything to curb climate change, then you're going to suffer just as much as the next person. And in the same way, one of the examples that is most illustrative, perhaps, is that of Cambridge Analytica and how only 270,000 people agreed to give their data to the firm, to Cambridge Analytica, and with that data, Cambridge Analytica got to access the data of 87 million people, and these were the friends of the 270,000 people, and they didn't consent to that. They didn't even know it was happening. And with that data, Cambridge Analytica managed to build a tool that wanted to profile the users of the whole world, in fact, the voters, rather, of many countries around the world, and try to sway elections with that data. So that's one example in which it's very clear how when you share your data, it's not only a matter of a personal decision and a kind of personal preference, whether you like chocolate or vanilla, or whether you have something to hide or not. It's a political question, and it's a question of what you're doing to society and what you're doing to the people around you. So this raises all kinds of interesting questions. For the past few years, it has become somewhat popular to think that one way to recover some kind of power that we have lost in the digital age is to allow people to sell their own data. So instead of data brokers just collecting that data without your consent and selling it and earning money from it, and you don't earn anything, maybe you could sell your own data and you could be your data broker. This is a very popular idea, and there are companies that are trying to do this. And in the book, I argue that it makes no sense. First of all, because there's this aspect of privacy that is very collective. So what right do I have to sell my genetic data if that data also contains the data of my siblings? And on the other hand, there's also a lot of risks for society. So society has an interest that we protect our privacy. One of the things I argue in the book is that we have come to realize that the loss of privacy has really bad consequences for national security. We have built the internet largely to be insecure so that we can collect more data. And that means that we're all unsafe. So here are a few examples to show what I mean. One example is about a year ago, the New York Times published a piece by two journalists who claim not to be very tech savvy, and who nevertheless managed to get the location of the President of the United States simply through accessing data sold by data brokers, and this is something that almost anyone can buy, and figuring out who had a phone that was actually a Secret Service agent by correlating the schedule of the president with location. And if the President of the United States is not safe and can be located so easily, nobody's safe, because anyone is less protected than the President of the United States, or almost anyone. And the whole country is unsafe, which is obviously a huge problem. Another Another example of how national security can suffer from losses of privacy is that because we have very insecure devices and these devices are proliferating, it's easy to get to a very sensitive and secure device through an unsafe one. So for instance, say you have a smart kettle, and the smart kettle was really cheap, and it's by a company that doesn't upload security very often, and let's say that you connect your kettle to your phone or to your laptop. And even though your phone or your laptop can be really safe, if you connect this really insecure device, they can get to your phone or laptop through it. And that means that if hackers could get to you as an individual and harm you, but for national security purposes, hackers could just hack about 10% of electrical appliances and turn them on at the same time, and that would bring down the national grid, the electric grid. And you can imagine how concerning that is and how bad it could be for a country. Imagine just going through that during the pandemic. And this is not very hypothetical. There have been attacks to the UK national grid during the pandemic, which fortunately weren't successful. But you can imagine if one was successful and you're in lockdown, and not only can you not go out, but you don't even have electricity, you can't communicate with anyone, it could be seriously disastrous. So those are just some examples in which privacy is really bad for society as such. But it's not only society that loses out. It's also individuals, and it's also institutions. So as individuals, we are being exposed to all kinds of data-related harms. you and I are essentially not being treated as equal citizens, even if we live in the same country. If you're a guy, you probably see ads for higher paying jobs. Depending on the laptop that you have, you might pay a different price for the same seat on a plane. You might wait different times when you call customer service, depending on your data. And this is undermining equality. And obviously, equality also undermines democracy and the fabric of society. It undermines a lot of things. Another way in which we are being exposed is just through bad cybersecurity. Our cybersecurity is so bad that, I mean, it's really scandalously bad. It's actually quite terrifying. And that means that anybody could be a victim of identity theft, public humiliation, extortion. It happens all the time, and it's happening more and more. And one of the problems is that companies don't have an incentive to have good cybersecurity. It's very expensive. It's quite invisible, because as users, an app that has better cybersecurity than another doesn't necessarily look any different. We have some kind of idea of what is a good lock, like a bike lock or a good door, but we have no idea what an app looks like when it has good cybersecurity, because it doesn't look like anything. And that is one of the challenges of data and in general digital ethics, that most of the relevant elements here are very, very opaque and very invisible. So what is the answer? We have to regulate. There's no way around it. And I'm actually incredibly optimistic, which people find surprising, because if you read the book, there's a lot of reasons to be concerned. But when you look at history, we have been able to regulate any other industry that has ever come up. So our ancestors regulated railways, cars, airplanes, drugs, food. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to regulate our giants. It's just our turn, and we're gonna learn to do it just like they did. And but however, individuals have a really important role to play, because it's up to us to pressure politicians and to pressure companies so that change happens. And change will happen first with regulation, but also with companies realizing that privacy is actually a competitive advantage. And as people accumulate bad experiences online, they are more and more willing to pay for security. In a recent survey that I carried out with a colleague called Sian Brook in Oxford, we found that about 92% of people have had some kind of bad experience online related to privacy. In some cases, it's having your credit card number stolen. In other cases, it's public humiliation. And in some cases, it's even being the target of spyware. And as more and more people have these bad experiences, or you know somebody who has had it, the more you realize that, well, maybe privacy is just as important as it used to be. And we have just as many reasons to protect it. I'm going to try to answer a question. Somebody asked, which philosopher do you best think understands or most interestingly characterizes privacy? That's a tough question. That's a very, very tough question. I found myself pretty unsatisfied with the literature in philosophy. And I wrote this book partly trying to think of what I wish I could have read when I got interested in the topic. And I think it's partly not the fault of philosophers. I think it wasn't as obvious, this relationship between privacy and power, as it is now. It was obvious in certain instances, but it was so rare in the grand scheme of things that we didn't have enough evidence to think about it in such a systemic way, maybe. Or maybe we just forgot about it for a while. So I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But talking about like how important privacy is and how we forgot that lesson, one of the stories that most struck me when I was researching privacy is that of the Second World War. One of the justifications for collecting so much data in the past few years has been 9/11, and how the idea was that, yeah, we should allow these companies to collect all this data because they earn money, and we, the government, can literally make a copy of the data and hopefully keep people safe. Now, it turns out that big data is not the kind of analysis that is good for preventing terrorism, because terrorism is an incredibly rare event, and big data is really good at figuring out like what are you going to buy this month, because millions and actually billions of people buy things every day. So there's a lot of data on that. Whereas terrorism is always going to be a really rare event. And there are other reasons why big data doesn't really work for that. But the point is, we forgot how the loss of privacy could be dangerous for national security. I've already mentioned a couple of cases, but one really important historical case is that of the Second World War. Because if you look at history, more people have died indirectly as a result of privacy losses than from something like terrorism. During the Second World War, one of the first things that the Nazis did when they invaded a city was go to the registry, because that's where the data was held, and they wanted to figure out where Jewish people lived. And there's a really interesting study that compares the country in Europe that had the most data on citizens, which was the Netherlands, versus the country that had the least data on citizens, which was France. And France had made a conscious decision not to collect certain kinds of data. In 1872, for privacy reasons, they decided not to collect data related to religion and ancestry, and like things like where your grandparents live. Whereas in the Netherlands, there was a guy who was a pioneer of statistics. He invented the ID card, and he wanted a system that could follow people from cradle to grave. That is an actual code. And the result was that when the Nazis went to France, the French said, we have no idea how many Jewish people we have, let alone where they live. And the Nazis didn't have anything to go on. They depended on Jewish people either turning themselves in, or neighbors or other people turning them in. And that was really inefficient. Whereas in the Netherlands, they knew exactly where to look. And the result was that in the Netherlands, the Nazis found about 75% of the Jewish population and killed them. And in France, 25%. And the difference is hundreds of thousands of people who got saved in France simply by not collecting data. And there's one particularly striking story about a guy called René Carmy, who was the general comptoir of the army. And when the Nazis were so surprised that the French didn't have this data, he said, well, I volunteered to collect that data, because he had Hollerith machines that were these punch card machines from IBM. And so he went off to collect the data, and months passed and the data wasn't delivered to the Nazis. More months passed and the data was not delivered to the Nazis. Eventually, the Nazis caught on that maybe that data was never going to be delivered. And it turned out that René Carny was one of the highest ranking officers in the resistance. And he had never planned to give that data to the Nazis. So he did do the punch cards and created the census, but he never recorded the answer of people when they answered, whether they were Jewish or not. And one person deciding not to collect sensitive data saved hundreds of thousands of people. And that should tell us something. Another interesting story from the Second World War is about the registry in Amsterdam. A resistance cell realized that how dangerous the registry was. So they decided to go into the registry, set fire to the records, and try to save people that way. And unfortunately, they were very unsuccessful. They got caught and killed, and they only managed to destroy 15% of the records, even though they had a plan in which the fire department was going to arrive late. They had some people in the fire department. And the plan was that they were going to arrive late and that they were going to use more water than necessary to allow more destruction of files. And as I said, they were pretty unsuccessful, and 70,000 Jews got found and killed in Amsterdam. And for me, the lesson is that the Dutch had made two very big mistakes. The first one is that they had collected much more data than necessary. And the second one was that they didn't have an easy way to delete the data in the event of an emergency. And we are making both of those mistakes at a grand scale never seen before. That should make us think twice and think very carefully about the kind of structure we're building and whether that structure might be used for authoritarian purposes in the future. And if it can be used for that, we are in serious trouble, because the Nazis had very, very little data compared to what we have. We have enormous amounts of data. So that's one risk that we should have very much in mind. Democracy is not at the best place. It has been in the last few years. That's no secret. And it's very fragile. And we are incurring a huge risk by creating this surveillance structure. So that's one concern. I'll go on with a question. I'm sorry, I digressed. Do you think it's beneficial to create an ideal theory of privacy? I'm not sure what you mean by an ideal theory. I think it's important to know what privacy is in a descriptive way. I think it's important to know why privacy is important, and in a normative way. So because it protects things like equality, because it protects freedom of thought, because it protects creativity, because it protects the safety of individuals and society. There are all these reasons. And then I think we should think about how do we instantiate that in real life. And I think that being very practical is incredibly important these times, because if you have like a grand philosophical theory that has no relation to reality and you have no practical solutions, then it's not going to be worth much and people are not going to listen. So something that I have tried to do in the book is to be as practical as I possibly can be. So the last 2 chapters are all about what we can do both as individuals, but also as a society, and what regulators can do. So the question goes on. If we see privacy as a right, how can the negative and positive liberty framework coined by Berlin help us better understand how privacy can be empowering? That's interesting. That's an interesting question. So there is a paper about that I'm not going to remember the title. But if you email me, I will find it. And the paper argues that privacy is incredibly important for negative freedom. Because the moment that we know we are being surveilled and that has consequences, it basically creates a chilling effect. And I see this happening all the time. Academics are self-censoring routinely, not only because of the surveillance of the state, which is partly about that, but also just the surveillance of the general population and avoiding things like trolling. So, working in a topic like ethics and politics is really risky business these days. And one of the things that I have argued elsewhere, I have a paper called Online Masquerade, and it's open access, so it's easy to find and access. And I argue that our internet world should look much more like an online masquerade than us dealing with our real identities. And in fact, most writing before the Renaissance was written pseudonymously or anonymously. And many of the great writings of great philosophers were written that way. John Locke wrote many of his works like that. Kierkegaard, the Federalist Papers, many great works. And I argue that academics should have that option when they want to argue something that is controversial, to have the option of publishing it pseudonymously. But also we, as just regular citizens, if we could use pseudonyms on, say, Twitter and Facebook, we would be much more protected from authoritarian regimes, from trolls, and from all kinds of harms. So if you're interested in that, you can check that paper out. Another question is, do you believe we can take back control of our personal data, or privacy is dead and we just try to share this power at least to more companies to prevent monopoly? That's a really good question. I think we can take back control of our personal data for sure. Privacy is not dead, okay? And here's a test. Next time you're in a public bathroom, which granted might be a while, depending on where you live, just take a peek at the stall next to you and say hi to the occupant there. You will not be disappointed. They will be upset. And if privacy was dead, we wouldn't care about those kind of things, right? If privacy was dead, you would be happy to send us your email and password right now through the chat. And I challenge anyone to do that. I don't think there's going to be many takers. So privacy is a matter of, it's a gradient. It's not like you have privacy or you don't have, and that's it. It's a matter of how much privacy you have, and it matters a great lot how much privacy you have. So one of the things I argue is that you should take action to try to protect your privacy, knowing that you'll fail. But you're not. even if you only get to protect a little bit of your data, that's progress, and that might be enough to save you from identity theft or from a case of public humiliation. And more importantly, when you try to protect your privacy, it really sends out a message. I think people would be incredibly surprised if they realized how much companies and governments, including authoritarian governments, care about what people think. And when you tell a company, no, I don't consent to your data collection, or when you ask them to send you your data and to have it deleted, they care, they freak out, which is a good thing because it encourages them to think about alternative business models, but also it creates a data trail. And that's a paper trail. It's very important when regulators look at that company and the company says, well, yeah, we did all these horrible things, but hey, our users were consenting, and that there's evidence that actually we're not consenting voluntarily. We're being forced to do it, and they're just telling us that we're consenting. So it's really important, and there are lots of things that you can do. You can contact your political representatives and push them on this. Obviously, you can choose privacy-friendly alternatives. Instead of using Google, use DuckDuckGo. Instead of using WhatsApp, use Signal. Instead of using Gmail, use things like ProtonMail. And for every privacy-invasive app out there, there's probably a privacy-friendly alternative, and more, that's more and more the case. And I know it sounds idealistic, but I'm really not. Like, if you ask my family and friends, I'm not like the optimistic kind. But just look at history and how many things we have achieved that didn't seem possible. From abolishing child labor to coming up with 8-hour shifts and weekends and maternity and paternity leave and all kinds of things that seemed absolutely unthinkable at some point. And one of the things that makes me optimistic is that in the recent past, governments didn't feel motivated to regulate data. But now that it's becoming so clear how data is a liability for national security, and now that Russia and Korea are really making use of that, and China, I think our governments are waking up. And already we can hear a lot of talk in the US of a new privacy law, a federal law, which would be very positive. And even the GDPR is an absolute miracle. It's not good. I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, it needs a lot of work, and it's not perfect. Obviously, it's not perfect. If it were perfect, we wouldn't have all these scandals still. But it was a step in the right direction, and it was a step that 5 years before, everybody thought it was impossible, and people laughed at it. I mean, people laughed at it. And for all its faults, it's created a real awareness about privacy. It's made companies like Google and Facebook have to change some practices. Obviously not enough, but we're getting there. And some of the things that I think we have to do, I'll just mention a few. One is to ban trades in personal data. It's just wrong. The fact that we allow data brokers to profit from things like knowing who has been the victim of a rape and compiling that data and selling that list is just incredibly morally repugnant and concerning in all sorts of ways. Data brokers collect data like who suffers from impotence and premature ejaculation, who has lost a kid in an accident, who has cancer, all kinds of data that we shouldn't allow people to profit from. So that's the first step. Even in the most capitalist of societies, we agree that there are things that shouldn't be for sale. So we don't sell votes, we don't sell children, we don't sell even the results of football matches or sports matches, and we shouldn't sell personal data. It creates the incentive of collecting much more data than needed and selling it to the highest bidder, which is ridiculous if you think about it. Another thing that we have to do is to ban personalized ads. They are very risky because they create this personalized propaganda, they polarize society, they create informational ghettos, and the advantages we get from them are minor, if any at all, and we can get them in other ways. So one of the objections that people routinely level at me is like, well, but I like kind of relevant ads, and I don't want to be shown ads that are not interesting. The first response is like, okay, even if it was the case that you would have to give up interesting ads, are you willing to give up your democracy just to look at ads that you're interested in? Is that like, I don't know, reasonable? And the second thing is that you actually don't have to give up that. We can give you relevant ads without having to access your data. So for instance, if you're reading an article about bicycles, there's a good chance that you're interested in bicycles, sporting gear, etc. We don't need to know how old you are, what's your purchasing power, where do you live, what are your sexual practices, what are your political tendencies. We don't need to know that, and it's outrageous that we send this data, incredibly sensitive data, to hundreds of advertisers every minute of the day. It's just absurd. A third really important thing that we have to do is we have to implement fiduciary duties in the case of personal data. So fiduciary duties are duties that a professional owes to a client in virtue of a relationship that's very asymmetrical in power and in which the professional can have conflicts of interest. So examples are doctors and patients, lawyers and clients, financial advisors and clients. You can imagine your doctor might want to perform surgery on you to practice their skills or to get more money or whatever it might be, but they can only do that if it's for your own benefit. And in the same way, you can imagine your financial advisor wanting to buy more stocks than is wise to get a commission, but they can only do that if it's in your benefit. So in the same way, anyone who wants to collect or manage personal data should accept a duty of care. And if they don't want to accept a duty of care, then they should look for a different job. Just like it's not enough to be a doctor to like to cut people up and see what's inside. You have to accept that responsibility and care for that patient. And if you don't, then you shouldn't be a doctor. And in the same way, if you want to manage personal data, you can only use it to benefit the people that you are studying. You can never use it against them. So those are some of the policies I think we should have. In my book, I have a lot more, but that's kind of gives you an idea of where I think we should walk towards. Does privacy differ across culture, or is it a universal concept? That's a really good question. Yes, it differs from culture to culture, but not as striking as you might think. So almost every society that we have ever studied has a concept of privacy. It's just that it varies in the way it expresses itself. So for instance, every culture has a concept of what it means to be naked, but it's not the same one in every culture. So in some African cultures, what it means to be naked is to show your knees. In the West, that's not the case, but there is a concept of being naked. In the same way, for instance, a lot of the differences in privacy come because of the surrounding and how much money we have to protect our privacy. So for instance, there's some kinds of people living in the Arctic who don't have a lot of chance to have privacy because they live in such aggressive surroundings that if they were to go on their own, they wouldn't last long alive. So they have to remain in a group, and they live in igloos that don't have many separations. So they have a social norm according to which when one is facing a wall, you should just ignore that person and just imagine that they're not there and you can't talk to them. And that way, when we don't have physical ways of protecting our privacy, we create cultural ways of protecting it. And yeah, in Western culture, we have norms like what you ask and how close you stand to somebody and so on and so forth. So I think privacy is a universal concept. And in fact, I have the theory that it arises from very animalistic impulses and instincts. So animals have a need for their personal territory and they defend it very fiercely. And so do we. And privacy is that plus kind of the symbolic personal territory that comes with language and comes with information. But there are animals that don't have sex in front of other animals, for instance. And I think privacy is necessary for well-being, just as animals, and it's necessary for societies to thrive. So even, when you hear like, well, maybe China doesn't care so much about privacy, in fact, during the pandemic, we've seen a backlash and how people do care, because people care about their safety and people care about justice and people care about being treated right. And that's universal. So right now there's a backlash in China as well about companies. And that's really interesting because now it turns out like there starting to be efforts to protect people's privacy in the corporate context. And now, of course, but then you have the question of like government surveillance and there we saw some backlash during the pandemic. So we'll see how that develops. But yes, I think privacy is quite universal, even though it can have different expressions. Another question is, do you think it will ever be too late to do anything? A moment when one or the other party will have enough that it doesn't matter whether they will receive any more data? That's a tough question. I fear that something close to that might be the case. So my hope is that we're smart enough to regulate things in time and that we continue to have democracies that thrive. But my fear, and just to have a note of optimism, we did that with the ozone layer, right? So we're not totally helpless and hopeless. Like we sometimes seem like that, and we haven't done very well during the pandemic. But with the case of the ozone layer, we realized we were destroying it and we regulated in time, and now it's recovering and it will be fully recovered in a few years. My fear is that we won't be smart and we will wait until something extremely bad happens in the West, because the West doesn't seem to care enough about other countries, unfortunately. So I fear that something really bad might happen, like a genocide or something similar, that personal data is used in a way that is truly catastrophic, or maybe is used by another country, an adversary. I don't know, but I fear that we're going to wait until something extremely bad happens to regulate things. I hope we don't, but I think that might happen, and then it might be very bad. I'm not sure what it means to be too late, in the sense that it would never change, because the world changes a lot all the time. But I think it could be too late in the sense that we could undergo immense and very unnecessary suffering. Another question is, how do we have to change how we think about data? Do you see personal data as divisible from the people it describes? That's an interesting question. Some people think that data is constitutive of the person. So your data is part of you, like your hand is part of you. I'm not sure I take that view, and I'm not sure how important it is to agree on kind of the ontology of data. But one thing that I think is really important is to think about data as power. So like this response of, oh, I have nothing to hide. It's like saying, I don't mind being vulnerable to others. And I don't think that's the case for anyone or the vast majority of people. So I think we should think about data as power and not as money. Money is secondary in a way. I mean, of course, Google wants data because it can monetize that, but it wants it even more because it can have power. Power gets you anything. Power gets you money, but it gets you so much more than money. It gets you a voice in how the laws are built. It can even get you out of law. I mean, to break the law. And so power is really the essential thing there. And I think we should think about data as collective. So we should keep in mind that every time you share something about yourself, you're also sharing something about others. Even if it's just about your personality, even if you answer one of these personality tests online that tell you, I don't know, which cartoon you're most like, or which Power Ranger, or whatever it is, you're actually sharing things about people who share your personality traits. So you and I might never meet and might never have met, but if you and I have very similar psychological profiles, and you share things about you, it's like you're sharing things about me. Another question is, in data-driven civilizations, who carries the counterpart duties in practice to a right to privacy? That's an excellent question. That's not part of my Privacy is Power book, but it's part of my next book. And I think we all have that duty in different ways. So governments and companies have different duties on the basis of how much more power they have and their role they play. So one of the things I argue is that it's wrong for companies to collect our data the way they do, not only because they rob us of our privacy, which is absolutely true, but also because they don't allow us to honor our duties towards others regarding privacy. So I'll give you an example. These days, because of lockdown, I have to teach online. And many times, I don't get to decide which platform I use to teach, or it's not always easy. And I would like to be able to guarantee to my students that their confidentiality is safe. But I can't, because I'm not in control of those platforms. And so when a platform collects my data, it's not only that they're harming me by depriving me of my privacy, that's true, but also they're depriving me of the opportunity to fulfill my responsibility as a professor towards my students. So I think governments and companies have more responsibility in virtue of their power, but individuals definitely have a responsibility, and that means that, basic things. You shouldn't take pictures of people and upload them. You should ask for consent whenever, say, you invite someone to your home. If you have a smart device, you should warn them about it. We should cultivate a culture of privacy. And that means that we are losing out on many things if we don't. We are not going to have as intimate relationships if there's always a phone between us that can be recording. And then if we know, even subconsciously, that whatever we say can be uploaded to Twitter one day. We are not going to have frank debates in the classroom if we're always having a camera and a microphone there. We are losing out in intimacy, in creativity, in honesty, in frankness. And I argue that we should become better at creating spaces of privacy, times and zones in which there are no microphones, no cameras, and we can just relate to each other as human beings and be as honest and as relaxed as we possibly can with each other. So we are running out of time, but thank you so much for your excellent questions. And just to end, it might seem radical to suggest that we should end the data economy. We've become so used to it, but it's partly just because that's the status quo, and if it was different, we would think differently. But really, what's radical, what's extreme, is to have a business model that depends on the systematic and mass violation of rights. That's completely unacceptable, and we shouldn't get used to it. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you read the book, and if you like it, tell me what you think. Thank you so much for your time. Bye.